The gunshot wound in his shoulder had healed 11 years ago, but the silence in his eyes never did, and on the morning I found him on his knees in the mud, hammering the same fence post for the 4th time because his hands wouldn't stop shaking. I understood that some wars never really end. They just move indoors, into the quiet hours when no one is watching. I stood at the edge of my yard holding a cup of coffee that had gone cold in my hand, watching a 71-year-old man fight a losing battle against a piece of wood. And something in me that had been asleep for a long time finally woke up. My name is Daniel, and before that morning, I was the kind of man who waved at his neighbors, and nothing more. I had my own war, though mine didn't come with medals. Mine came with divorce papers, a mortgage I could barely afford alone, and a father I hadn't spoken to in 6 years because pride is a disease that spreads quietly and kills relationships one silence at a time. I had moved into that small house on Maple Hollow Road 8 months earlier, after everything in my old life had folded in on itself, and I had spent those 8 months mostly alone, working from my kitchen table, eating dinner standing up because sitting down at an empty table felt like admitting defeat. I noticed my neighbor, an old man named Frank Whitman, mostly from a distance. He lived alone in a house that seemed to sag under the weight of memory, and every morning at exactly 6:15 he would walk to his mailbox, check it, and walk back, even though I rarely saw mail arrive for him. It was the kind of routine that told a story if you paid attention. The story of a man clinging to structure, because structure was the only thing standing between him and whatever waited in the emptiness of his days. That morning changed everything. I set my coffee down on the porch railing and walked across the wet grass without fully deciding to. The way your feet sometimes know something your mind hasn't caught up to yet. Frank didn't hear me approach, not because he was deaf, but because he was somewhere else entirely, somewhere with sound I couldn't hear and enemies I couldn't see. When I said good morning, he flinched so hard he nearly fell backward, and for one terrible second, the look in his eyes wasn't confusion. It was fear, raw and ancient. The kind of fear that lives in a person's body long after their mind has moved on. Then it passed, and he blinked, and he was just an old man in the mud again, embarrassed, gripping a hammer with white knuckles. He told me the fence had been falling apart for 2 years, and that he kept telling himself he'd fix it properly once the weather turned better, but the weather always seemed to turn worse instead. I offered to help. I don't fully know why. Maybe because I needed something to do with my hands, too. Maybe because loneliness recognizes loneliness the way certain frequencies only resonate with each other. Frank refused twice, the way proud men do, insisting he didn't need charity, that he'd built things with his own 2 hands, his whole life, and he wasn't about to stop now. But his hands were shaking, and we both knew it, and eventually he said fine, if I insisted, but only because he didn't want to be rude, not because he needed the help. We both let him keep that dignity. It cost me nothing, and it meant everything to him. If this story is already touching something in you, if you believe that small acts of kindness between strangers can crack open something bigger than either person expected, take a moment right now to like this video, leave a comment telling me where you're watching from, share it with someone who still believes in second chances, and subscribe to this channel because we tell stories like this one every single week. Stories about ordinary people who choose kindness, even when the world has given them every reason not to. The fence took us 6 weeks to finish properly, which surprised me, because at first I assumed it would take 2 Saturdays at most. But Frank worked slowly, not because he was incapable, but because every board seemed to carry a memory, and memories don't move quickly. On the 3rd Saturday, while we were measuring a section near the old oak tree, he told me, without looking up from his tape measure, that his wife used to sit under that tree every evening with a glass of iced tea, watching the sun go down, and that she had been gone for 4 years now, and that some mornings he still made 2 cups of coffee before he remembered. I didn't say anything profound. I just nodded and kept holding the board steady, because sometimes the most respectful thing you can do for someone's grief is simply witness it without trying to fix it. Over those 6 weeks, something shifted between us, slowly, the way trust always does, never in dramatic leaps, but in small deposits that accumulate until one day you realize you're no longer strangers. Frank started telling me pieces of his life in fragments, the way people do when they've spent years not talking to anyone. He told me about Vietnam, not the battles, but the quiet things, the way the humidity felt at 4 inches the morning, the names of the men in his unit who never made it home, the guilt of being the one who did. He told me about coming back to a country that didn't want to look at him, about spending 30 years working construction, because it was the only thing that let him use his hands hard enough to stop his mind from wandering to places he didn't want to go. He told me his wife's name was Clara, and that she was the only person who ever made the silence in him feel like peace instead of punishment. I found myself looking forward to those Saturdays more than I wanted to admit. My own life outside of Frank's yard remained mostly gray. I still hadn't called my father. I still ate dinner standing up most nights. I still flinched a little every time my phone buzzed with a message from my ex-wife's lawyer about final paperwork that never seemed to actually finalize anything. But something about standing in Frank's yard, hammering nails into old wood, listening to a man twice my age talk about grief and survival, made my own problems feel smaller. Not because they didn't matter, but because I could suddenly see them from the outside, the way you can see a maze clearly once you're standing above it instead of lost inside it. Frank noticed things about me too. The way people who have suffered often develop a radar for suffering in others. One afternoon, as we sat on his porch steps drinking sweet tea after finishing a particularly stubborn section of fence, he asked me, without any preamble, why a man my age spent every Saturday helping an old veteran, instead of being out living his life. I told him the truth, or most of it. I told him about the divorce, about the silence with my father, about how I had moved to Maple Hollow Road because I needed somewhere to disappear for a while. Frank listened the way he always listened, completely, without interrupting, without offering hollow comfort. When I finished, he said something I've carried with me ever since. He said that a man who disappears from his own life for too long forgets how to find his way back, and that the only cure he ever found for that particular sickness was doing something for someone else, because it reminds you that you still have hands worth using and a heart worth trusting. I didn't know it then, but Frank was already planning something, already turning over an idea in his mind the way he used to turn over a plan in the field, checking it from every angle before committing to it. He didn't tell me. He just kept working, kept talking, kept slowly opening doors inside himself that had been locked for years, and I kept showing up every Saturday, because by then it wasn't charity anymore. It wasn't even really about the fence. It was about two lonely men discovering that loneliness, when shared, becomes something else entirely. It becomes companionship. It becomes the first real friendship either of us had allowed ourselves in years. The fence was finished on a Saturday in late October, the air crisp enough to see your breath, the oak tree nearly bare. We stood back and looked at it together, this long line of new wood standing straight and solid where rot and neglect used to be, and Frank didn't say much. Just nodded slowly, the way men of his generation express pride, quietly, through stillness rather than words. Then he turned to me and said something that would change the direction of my life without either of us fully realizing it yet. He said, "There is someone I want you to meet." I assumed he meant an old army buddy, or maybe a cousin, someone from the fragments of his life he'd shared with me over those 6 weeks. I said, sure, of course, whenever works. Frank told me to come by the following Sunday afternoon around 2, and to wear something decent, not fancy, just decent. And there was something in the way he said it, a kind of nervous energy underneath his usual steady calm, that made me curious in a way I couldn't quite name. That week passed slower than any week had in months. I found myself unable to stop wondering who this person might be. I told myself it didn't matter, that I was simply doing a favor for a friend. But underneath that thought was another one, quieter, that whispered maybe this mattered more than I was letting myself believe. I hadn't felt genuine anticipation about anything in a long time. Anticipation requires hope, and hope had been in short supply in my life for longer than I cared to admit. So when Sunday finally arrived, I found myself standing in front of my closet for 20 minutes trying to decide what decent actually meant, which was, in itself, a strange kind of miracle. Because a man who has stopped caring about how he looks has usually stopped caring about a great many other things too. I walked over to Frank's house at exactly 2 o'clock, my heart doing something unfamiliar in my chest, something between nervousness and hope. Frank opened the door before I even knocked, as though he'd been watching from the window, and there was a warmth in his face I hadn't seen before. a kind of light that hadn't been there even during our best conversations on the porch. He led me through his living room, past photographs of Clara that I had come to recognize over the past 6 weeks, and out onto the back patio, where a young woman sat at a small table, her hands wrapped around a mug of coffee, her posture careful in the way people are careful when they're bracing themselves for something. Frank introduced her as Elena and told me she was his granddaughter, Clara's granddaughter really from her side of the family, and that she had reached out to him for the first time in nearly 5 years just 2 months earlier, around the same time I had started helping him with the fence. He said it like it was a coincidence, but I could tell from the way his voice caught slightly that he didn't fully believe it was one. Elena stood up to shake my hand, and there was something in her eyes, a kind of exhaustion mixed with cautious hope that reminded me uncomfortably of my own reflection in recent months. Over the next hour, sitting on that patio as the afternoon light slanted gold across the yard, the story came out in pieces, the way difficult stories always do. Elena had grown up close to Frank and Clara, spending summers at this very house, but after Clara passed away, something had broken in the family. An old argument between Frank and Elena's mother about money and grief and blame that neither of them had ever managed to resolve. And Elena had gotten caught in the middle, eventually pulling away entirely because it hurt less to have no family than to have one that fought constantly. She had moved 2 states away, built a life that looked fine from the outside, a decent job, a small apartment, a routine. But she confessed, her voice tightening as she spoke, that she often felt like she was living inside a house with no foundation, going through the motions of a life without ever feeling truly rooted in it. 2 months earlier, she said, she had woken up in the middle of the night from a dream about Clara, so vivid she could still smell her grandmother's perfume when she opened her eyes, and she had lain awake until morning thinking about all the time she'd let slip away out of stubbornness and hurt feelings. She had called Frank that same day, her hands shaking so badly she almost hung up before he answered. Frank told me, his eyes glistening in a way I had never seen from him, that when he heard her voice on the phone after 5 years of silence, he had to sit down on the kitchen floor because his legs simply stopped working properly, and that it was the closest he had felt to Clara since she passed. Because reconciling with Elena felt like Clara reaching through time to put their family back together. One more time. I sat there listening, feeling something crack open inside my own chest, because I recognized every piece of this story. I recognized the stubbornness. I recognized the years slipping away disguised as pride. I recognized the fear of picking up a phone because once you hear the silence on the other end, or worse, the anger, you can never unhear it. Frank must have seen something shift in my face, because he looked at me directly and said that he hadn't only invited me over to meet Elena because he thought we might get along, though he clearly hoped we would, but because he wanted me to see with my own eyes what happens when 2 stubborn people finally choose courage over pride, because he suspected, correctly, that I was carrying my own unmade phone call, my own 5 years of silence waiting to happen if I didn't do something about it first. Elena and I talked for the rest of that afternoon, easily, in the way that sometimes happens between 2 people who recognize the same wound in each other. She asked about my life, and I told her more than I had told almost anyone, about my father, about the argument that started it all, something so small in hindsight, a disagreement over how I had handled my mother's estate after she passed, that had somehow calcified into 6 years of silence because neither of us knew how to be the one who apologized first. Elena listened, the way Frank listened, without judgment, and when I finished, she said something simple but devastating in its truth. She said that silence feels like protection while you're inside it, but from the outside, it just looks like 2 people choosing loneliness over love, because loneliness, at least, doesn't require vulnerability. I left Frank's house that evening with my mind spinning, unable to shake the feeling that I had been given something rare, a mirror held up at exactly the angle I needed to finally see myself clearly. That night, I sat at my kitchen table, the same table where I usually ate standing up, and I stared at my phone for nearly 2 hours before I found the courage to scroll to my father's name. My thumb hovered over the call button, so many times I lost count. I kept thinking about Frank sitting on his kitchen floor, his legs giving out from the shock of hearing his granddaughter's voice after 5 years, and I kept thinking that if a 71-year-old man who had survived a war could still be brought to his knees by the power of reconciliation, Then maybe I owed it to myself, and to my father, to find out what that same power might do for us. I called him a little after 9 that night. He answered on the 4th ring, his voice cautious, the way you answer a call from a number you don't recognize. Except he recognized it perfectly well. He just hadn't expected it. Not after 6 years. I don't remember exactly what I said. First, I think I said his name, and then I couldn't say anything else for a long moment, because my throat had closed up entirely. He said my name back, and there was so much in the way he said it, relief and hurt and hope all tangled together, that I finally understood what Elena meant about silence, only looking like protection from the inside. My father and I talked for almost 3 hours that night, about nothing at first, careful, testing the water, and then slowly about everything. About my mother, about the estate, about how much we had both missed each other without ever finding the words to say so. We didn't solve 6 years of distance in one phone call. That's not how healing works, not the real kind. But we built a bridge that night, a small one, unsteady, but real, and we agreed to see each other the following weekend, in person, for the first time since my mother's funeral. If you have someone in your life that you've been meaning to call, a parent, a sibling, an old friend, someone on the other side of a silence you've let grow too long, I want you to take this as your sign. Life is shorter than pride ever admits, and second chances don't wait forever for us to be ready. If this story is stirring something in you right now, please take a moment to like this video and leave a comment, because I read every single one, and I promise you that hearing your stories reminds me why we make these videos in the first place. Over the following months, my life began to change in ways I couldn't have predicted on that muddy morning. When I first saw Frank struggling with his fence, my father and I began rebuilding, slowly, carefully, the way you rebuild anything that's been neglected for years, with patience and small, consistent effort rather than grand gestures. We started having dinner together every other Sunday, and somewhere around the 3rd or 4th dinner, I noticed I had stopped eating, standing up at my own kitchen table, because I finally had something worth sitting down for. Elena and Frank's relationship deepened as well. She started visiting most weekends, and I would often find myself invited over for dinner, the 3 of us sitting around Frank's table, which had clearly not seen this much use since Clara was alive. And there was something healing about being present for someone else's family, knitting itself back together, while my own family did the same thing in parallel. As though the universe had decided both stories needed to happen at once, so each of us could witness proof that it was possible. Elena and I grew close during those months too, in a way I hadn't expected, but also hadn't fought against. It started as friendship, built on the shared understanding of what it means to lose years to stubbornness. But it slowly became something more tender than that, something neither of us rushed, because we both understood that whatever this was, it deserved patience rather than urgency. We would sit on Frank's porch some evenings after dinner, watching the same sunset Clara used to watch from under the oak tree, and Elena told me once that she felt like her grandmother had somehow orchestrated all of it. The dream that woke her in the night, the phone call to Frank, the timing of my showing up in his life, right when he needed someone to help him rebuild, not just a fence, but a family. I told her I didn't know if I believed in things happening for a reason, not in a neat, tidy way, but I did believe that kindness has a way of rippling outward further than we can ever predict when we first choose to offer it, and that maybe that was its own kind of magic, without needing anything more mystical attached to it. Frank changed too, in ways that were subtle but profound if you knew what to look for. He started sleeping through the night more consistently. He told me once, no longer waking at 3 inches the morning with his heart racing from dreams he wouldn't describe in detail. He started making only 1 cup of coffee in the mornings instead of 2. Not because he had forgotten Clara, he was careful to clarify, but because he had finally found other reasons to be present in his own life instead of living half in memory and half in a present he couldn't quite bring himself to fully inhabit. He joined a support group for veterans that met on Tuesday evenings at the community center, something Elena had gently encouraged him toward, and he told me after his 3rd meeting that it was the first time in decades he had spoken about certain memories out loud to people who understood, without him having to explain, and that the relief of that was almost impossible to put into words. I think about that morning often, the one where I stood at the edge of my yard with cold coffee in my hand, watching a stranger struggle with a fence post. I think about how easy it would have been to simply go back inside, to mind my own business, to let a private man have his private struggle without intrusion. I think about how many mornings like that must happen all over the world, small moments of quiet suffering happening in plain sight, waiting for someone to simply notice, to cross the yard, to say good morning and mean it. I don't think what happened between Frank and me, and what happened afterward with Elena and my father, was extraordinary in the sense of being rare or magical. I think it was ordinary kindness offered without expectation, allowed to grow slowly over time. And I think that's exactly why it worked, because it wasn't a grand gesture. It was 6 Saturdays of showing up, one board at a time. Frank told me something during our last Saturday working on that fence, something I didn't fully understand until much later. He said that when you fix something broken with your own hands, whether it's a fence or a family or a friendship, you have to be willing to work slowly, to accept that some boards will need to be replaced entirely, while others just need to be straightened and reinforced, and that the temptation to rush the process, to slap a quick fix on something that needs real repair, will only mean you're back out there fixing the same section again in another year or two. I didn't know then that he was talking about more than fences. I know now that he was preparing me, in his quiet, indirect way, for the slow work of repairing my relationship with my father, for the patient work of building something real with Elena, for the ongoing work every one of us has to do if we want the broken parts of our lives to hold up against the weather that inevitably comes. It's been almost a year now, since that muddy October morning. My father and I talk every week, and last month he met Elena for the first time at a dinner Frank hosted. The two families that had been circling each other through my life finally meeting around one table, and watching my father laugh at something, Frank said. Watching Elena help my father with the dishes afterward, like she'd known him for years instead of hours. I felt something in my chest that I can only describe as the opposite of the loneliness I carried for so long before that fence needed fixing. Frank still checks his mailbox every morning at 6:15, but now Elena calls him most days. So there is usually something waiting for him besides silence. The fence still stands, weathered a little now by the seasons, but solid, and every time I see it, I think about how the smallest decision, crossing a yard on an ordinary morning, can end up rebuilding far more than wood and nails ever could. Before I close this story, I want to ask something small of you, something that means more than you might realize. If this story touched you, if any part of it reminded you of someone you've lost touch with, or reminded you that kindness offered freely can travel further than we ever expect, I want you to type the word second in the comments below. Just that one word. So I know how many of you are carrying your own unmade phone call, your own fence that needs fixing, your own second chance, waiting on the other side of a little bit of courage. Frank passed away peacefully this past spring, in his sleep, in the house he shared with Clara for over 40 years. And Elena was the one who found him the next morning when he didn't answer her call. And though the grief of that loss sits heavy in all of us who loved him, there is a strange comfort in knowing he spent his final months surrounded by family he thought he had lost forever, laughing at his own table, sleeping through the night, no longer carrying the war alone. At his funeral, Elena stood up and told the story of the fence, of how a stranger crossing a muddy yard had somehow led her grandfather back to his family before it was too late. And she looked at me while she said it, and I understood then that this is what kindness does when we allow it room to grow. It doesn't just fix what's broken in the moment. It creates enough time and enough love that when the end eventually comes, as it does for all of us, it comes gently, surrounded by the very people we almost let slip away. I helped my neighbor repair his fence, and in doing so, I found my father again. I found Elena, and I found a version of myself I had almost forgotten how to be. And if there is one thing I hope you carry with you from this story, it's that the smallest act of showing up for someone else might just be the thing that saves you both.